Russia said its troops stopped fighting in Ukraine at noon Moscow time under President Vladimir Putin's order of a 36-hour ceasefire for the Orthodox Christmas holiday. Kyiv dismissed the offer as a ploy. Air raid sirens rang out across the country shortly after the deadline, Ukraine said, as Russian jets took off from air bases in Belarus and NBSP. Russia's embassy in Berlin condemned Thursday's move by the US and Germany to send armored combat vehicles, including the Marder, and a Patriot missile defense system to Ukraine. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky spoke Friday with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. Ahead of their planned ceasefire, Kremlin forces continued limited counterattacks to regain lost positions along the Svatov-Kreminna line. Russian forces claimed that Ukrainian troops continued counteroffensive operations in the area. Ukraine's military reportedly conducted a successful counterattack as Russian forces continued offensive operations around Bakhmut and west of Donetsk city. The Biden administration announced a $2.85 billion package of military hardware to Ukraine, supplying the sort of powerful weapons that it had previously withheld. The package includes 50 Bradley fighting vehicles, as previously indicated, but also, for the first time, the Paladin self-propelled howitzer artillery system. The weaponry additionally includes surface-to-air missiles, armored personnel carriers and ammunition. It marks a major step forward in what the US has been willing to give Ukraine. Ukraine's foreign exchange reserves ticked up to $28.5 billion as of January 1, according to preliminary data posted on the Ukrainian National Bank's website. Reserves increased by 1.9% compared with November, thanks to inflows from international partners, the central bank said. The influx exceeded sales by the NBU through interventions to maintain the fixed exchange rate, the statement said. The emerging deal Kevin McCarthy is discussing to make him Speaker of the U.S. House would propose a roughly $75 billion cut in defense spending at a time the U.S. is intent on backing Ukraine against the Russian invasion and grows more wary of China's stepped-up aggression toward Taiwan. The Russian embassy in Berlin condemned Germany's decision to supply Ukraine with combat vehicles and a Patriot air defense system, saying the move will seriously affect German-Russian relations, and calling it a further step towards escalation of the conflict. Germany aims to deliver around 40 combat vehicles and a Patriot air defense system to Ukraine by the end of March as part of an effort to help the government in Kyiv in the event fighting intensifies in the spring. Russia said its troops stopped fighting in Ukraine at noon Moscow under President Vladimir Putin's order of a 36-hour ceasefire for the Orthodox Christmas holiday. Kyiv dismissed the offer as a ploy. The document, a copy of which was seen by Bloomberg News, calls the effort part of revenue mobilization. It also orders 175 billion rubles, $2.4 billion, in extra spending to resettle 100,000 people from Kherson to Russia. Ukraine has not agreed to the ceasefire, with some officials believing it's actually a trick. Mikhailo Podolyak, a top advisor to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, said on social media Thursday that the Christmas truce is a cynical trap and an element of propaganda. In an overnight address, Zelensky said Moscow wants to use Christmas as a cover so it can take the time to reposition its troops without the threat of Ukrainian advancement, allowing Russia to come back with renewed force. Though the Kremlin called the truce, it's also unclear if Russia itself is abiding by it. The New York Times reported that on Friday, Russian strikes on Ukraine continued, although it remains unclear if they happened before or after the truce was set to start at noon local time on Friday. Analysts told the New York Times that in addition to the ceasefire potentially being a strategy for Russia to regroup its forces, it also might be an attempt to gather more support at home under the guise of honoring the birth of Christ. Podolyak, the senior Ukrainian official, also said in a tweet Thursday that Russia must leave the occupied territories, arguing that only then will it have a temporary truce. Doubt remains over Vladimir Putin's temporary ceasefire after reports that artillery fire can be heard from the frontline and air raid sirens are ringing across Kyiv. Putin called for a temporary ceasefire starting at midday on Friday, 9 a.m. UK time, after the head of the Russian Orthodox Church requested it for 36 hours to mark Christmas. But questions have been raised over whether the ceasefire has faltered as sirens have been heard across Kyiv and Reuters reports that artillery has been heard from the frontline. Air raid warnings sounded in several regions across Ukraine, including around the capital Kyiv, but no major airstrikes were reported by Ukrainian officials after the ceasefire's starting time. Moscow said Ukraine had shelled military positions in Russian-held including Luhansk, Donetsk and Zaporizhia. Reports are coming out of Ukraine that artillery fire has been heard after Putin called a temporary ceasefire earlier today. One witness in the Russian-occupied regional capital Donetsk, close to the front, described to Reuters that artillery fired from pro-Russian positions on the city's outskirts could be heard after the truce was meant to take effect. Ukrainian presidential advisor Mikhailo Podolyak has said Russia's temporary ceasefire for Christmas is cynical deception. Russian shells hit the city of Kramatorsk in the Donetsky region of Ukraine just hours before Putin's temporary ceasefire for Orthodox Christmas, according to Kyrylo Tymoshenko, deputy head of the office of Ukraine's president. Mayor of Kramatorsk Alexander Honcharenko urged residents to stay in shelters, reporting that 14 homes were damaged as a result of the rocket that hit the residential building. Air raid sirens have been heard all across Ukraine today despite Putin announcing a temporary ceasefire for Russia to mark Orthodox Christmas. The head of the Russian Orthodox Church asked for a ceasefire to start at midday in Moscow, 9 a.m. UK time, on Friday and last for 36 hours. Friday is Christmas Eve in Moscow and Saturday, January 7th is Christmas Day. On Christmas Eve for Russians and for many Ukrainian people, Russian shells have hit Kramatorsk, a city in the Donetsk region of Ukraine that Russia has claimed. Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko visited a military base where Russian troops are stationed, the defense ministry said on Friday. Belarus, which is closely allied with Moscow, said on Thursday that it will receive more weapons and equipment from Russia as the two boost their military cooperation, fueling fears it could be used as a staging post to attack Ukraine from the north. Minsk has said it will not enter the war in Ukraine, but Russia used Belarus as a launch pad for its invasion in February and continues to use Belarusian airspace for drone and missile strikes, Kyiv says. The absorption of militias from the Luhansk People's Republic, LNR, and Donetsk People's Republic, LPR, carried out last week, is set to squeeze out Russian finances and weigh heavily on Moscow politically, the British Defense Ministry said today. Vladimir Putin's call for truce could likely be to help his forces invading Ukraine catch a break before starting the offensive in critical positions on the front lines, according to an analysis by the Institute for the Study of War, ISW. The U.S. is sending about 50 Bradley fighting vehicles to Ukraine, two U.S. officials said, confirming that the U.S. Army staple vehicle is part of the package worth roughly $2.8 billion, £2.35 billion. An armored vehicle with a powerful gun, the Bradley fighting carrier is manufactured by BAE Systems plc and used by the U.S. Army to transport soldiers in battlefields since the mid-1980s. The vehicle can help carry additional ammunition and communications equipment as the war heats up during the thick of winter. It has been offered as France also sent light AMX-10 RC armored combat vehicles to Ukraine amid debates if it qualifies as a tank. U.S. to send Ukraine dozens of Bradleys in $2.85 billion aid package. Volodymyr Zelensky rejects Russia's truce call in a tit-for-tat move. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has slammed Russia's ceasefire call, set to start today, and reminded the Kremlin of previous two calls for peace in November and December when at least 95,000 Russian forces had been killed in the war. Russia has already lost almost 110,000 of its soldiers in the war. Volodymyr Zelensky had proposed a Russian troop withdrawal earlier, before December 25, but Russia rejected it. Joe Biden has termed his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin's call for ceasefire in the continuing Ukraine interesting, adding that the Kremlin leader's offer is a sign of desperation. The ceasefire will be observed by the Russian forces starting today as Orthodox Christians living in Russia and Ukraine will mark the festival of Christmas. Russia's forces have brought a temporary halt to hostilities in Ukraine after Vladimir Putin called a ceasefire to mark Orthodox Christmas and allow his troops to attend church services. But his Ukrainian counterpart, Volodymyr Zelensky, rejected the call for a temporary truce, accusing Russia of seeking to halt Kyiv's progress in the bitter fight for the Donbas region of eastern Ukraine, where the conflict has become a drawn-out war of attrition in recent months, with the brutal winter weather settling in to make conditions on the ground even tougher. His advisor, Mikhailo Podolyak, also reacted angrily to Mr. Putin's appeal, saying Russia must leave the territory it has occupied and only then will it have a temporary truce. U.S. President Joe Biden appeared to agree with that assessment, saying he believed that Mr. Putin was trying to find some oxygen. Before the announcement of the order from Moscow, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said he had detected no change in Moscow's stance towards Ukraine, insisting that the Kremlin wants a Europe where they can control a neighboring country. Ukraine likewise remains unwavering in its refusal to concede a single square inch of ground to Russia, which began its invasion on February 24 last year, apparently expecting a swift conquest but instead encountering a courageous resistance from its neighbors, well armed by its Western allies, forcing a number of embarrassing retreats and a reliance on heavy bombing campaigns. Mr. Cleverly was speaking at a press conference in London alongside German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock, where the pair suggested that heavy tanks may well be part of future support for Ukraine, but stopped short of joining the US in formally committing to sending them. Vladimir Putin ordered a 36-hour ceasefire among Russian troops on Friday to honor the Orthodox Christmas, but Ukraine refused to do the same. The proposed truce is a significant moment for this long and brutal battle, although it's worth noting that there have already been reports of shelling in the city of Bakhmut. Moscow suggested the ceasefire would allow Russia's Orthodox Church to observe Christmas on January 7, and any fellow followers in Ukraine. The head of the Russian Orthodox Church, Patriarch Kirill, has been a keen supporter of the war, previously stating that military duty washes away all sins, but called for a Christmas truce shortly before Putin. However, the idea that Ukraine would be willing to halt the war effort temporarily in favor of a religious holiday is flawed, considering the Ukrainian Orthodox Church has cut ties with its Russian counterpart since the war began. Many Ukrainian believers also started celebrating Christmas on December 25 in line with Europeans this year, as another means to distance themselves from their neighbors. CNN reported that the truce also came after Putin spoke with his Turkish counterpart Tayyip Erdogan, who has tried to mediate between Russia and Ukraine. After their talks, the Russian president said he was open to serious dialogue regarding Ukraine, but Kyiv has to accept new territorial realities going forward. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said the ceasefire was only meant to be a cover for Russia to resupply and stop Ukrainian advances in the eastern Donbas region. Serhiy Haidai, who leads the Luhansk Regional Military Administration, told Ukrainian media that Russia just want to get some kind of pause for a day or two, to pull even more reserves, bring some more ammo. Russia cannot be trusted. Not a single word they say. Ukrainian presidential advisor Mikhailo Podolyak also claimed on Twitter that Russia has to leave the occupied territories of Ukraine before any temporary truce. Hours after Russia's announcement, Germany said it would follow the US and offer a Patriot air defense missile system to Kyiv along with Armo-Red vehicles. US President Joe Biden suggested that Putin was just trying to find oxygen through this proposal. Biden's claim that the Russian president is trying to buy time touches on the series of failures Russia has faced recently. Not only did Moscow lose hold of its Ukrainian land grabs from the early days of the war when Kyiv's successful counteroffensive swept through in the autumn, but missile strikes have started to reach deep inside Russia. Moscow has admitted that at least 89 Russians were killed on New Year's Eve, the most important date in the Russian calendar. The attack itself has led to backlash from respected Russian military figures too, especially as Moscow tried to blame its own soldiers for the missile strike. The UK's Ministry of Defence also shone a light on some of the divisions within Russia at the moment in its latest update. The death toll in Russia's December 29 missile attack on Ukraine rose to 3 people after another victim, a 40-year-old woman, died in hospital in Kyiv. The death was reported by Kyiv Mayor Vitaly Klitschko on January 6. The December 29 mass attack targeted 10 Ukrainian regions, including Kyiv. Only in the morning, Russia shot 69 missiles, according to Ukraine's Air Force, which reported shooting down 54 of them. Later in the day, Russia launched more missiles at Ukraine's northeast and south. At least 2 civilians were killed immediately during the December 29 attacks. Russian President Vladimir Putin's unilateral ceasefire along the front line in Ukraine from midday on January 6 to midnight on January 7 didn't last even an hour, according to Ukrainian officials. Shortly after noon Moscow time, when the truce supposedly came into effect, Deputy Head of the President's Office Kyrylo Tymoshenko reported the artillery shelling of the southern city of Kherson, with the city's fire department among the targets of the attack. Kherson Oblast Governor Yaroslav Yanushevich later confirmed 1 firefighter was killed and 4 were injured in the shelling. He said it was the second attack on the local rescuers in 2 days. The firefighters act as first responders on the scenes of Russian attacks. On the same day, the city of Kurakov in the eastern Donetsk Oblast came under Russian fire, Pavlo Kirilenko, the region's governor, said. The shelling reportedly hit 2 high-rise buildings and damaged a department of the local hospital, resulting in at least 1 injury. In the neighboring Luhansk Oblast, Moscow troops opened fire 14 times during the first 3 hours of the truce, according to Serhiy Haidai, the region's governor. In addition to firing artillery, Haidai said Russian forces also tried to storm one of the liberated villages in the area. Putin cited the occasion of the Orthodox Christmas to order a unilateral ceasefire. The Orthodox Christmas on January 7 remains the primary celebration date for most believers, although Ukraine has made the Western Christmas on December 25 an official holiday as well. The truce offer has been met with skepticism from both Kyiv and the West, with many viewing it as a ploy by Putin to regroup. President Volodymyr Zelensky dismissed Putin's ceasefire proposal as insincere. In recent weeks, Ukrainian officials stepped up their rhetoric on the prospects of Russia's war in Ukraine. Intelligence chief Kyrylo Budanov announced Ukraine is planning a major counteroffensive in spring, while Zelensky said in late December that Ukraine is on track to victory that all generations have dreamed of. U.S. to send $3 billion in aid to Ukraine with new air defense missiles. The U.S. aid package includes 50 Bradley fighting vehicles, 100 M113 armored personnel carriers, 55 mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles, MRAPs, and 138 Humvees, as well as ammunition for HIMARS, high-mobility artillery rocket systems, and air defense systems and other weapons, according to officials. The package consists of $2.85 billion in direct aid and $225 million in military financing for Ukraine's military modernization. The European Union countries also vowed to scale up their contributions to Ukraine in a bid to help Ukraine achieve a breakthrough in the war. Germany said on January 6 it would provide Ukraine with 40 Marder infantry fighting vehicles. According to Nils Schmid, a foreign policy spokesman for the Social Democratic Party, the vehicles could be delivered in the first quarter of 2023. After months of negotiations, Germany announced that it would be providing Ukraine with the Marder infantry fighting vehicles following a phone call between U.S. President Joe Biden and German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. Looking ahead to a likely spring offensive, the U.S. and Germany are sending Ukraine an array of armored vehicles, including 50 tank-killing Bradleys, to expand its ability to move troops to the front lines and beef up its forces against Russia as the war nears its first anniversary. The Bradleys and the 40 German Marders are among a wide variety of armored personnel carriers used by Western nations. They are designed to fit into what advanced militaries call a combined arms maneuver fight, the ability to use a wide range of ground, air, and other weapons and fighting units in seamless coordination to win a battle. The M2A2 Bradley is a medium armored combat vehicle that has tracks rather than wheels, but is lighter and more agile than a tank. It can carry a crew of 3 and an additional 5 or 6 troops, and is seen as a critical way to move infantry squads safely into battle. It is generally armed with a 25mm gun mounted on the top, a machine gun and an anti-tank TOW missile launcher that can be used when the Bradley is stopped. TOW stands for tube-launched, optically tracked, wire-guided, which means the missile is fired only at targets that troops can actually see on the battlefield, so it's very effective in open spaces such as deserts and large fields. Both Russia and Ukraine have suffered heavy losses of tanks and other armored vehicles in the last 10 months, so sending the Bradleys and Marders will help offset those losses. The decision to send the Bradleys reflects a steady progression in the complexity and lethality of the weapons systems the U.S. and its allies have provided over the course of the war. Many condemn the pace as too slow, arguing that Ukraine needs everything it can get to repel the Russians and that some territory losses could have been prevented if the U.S. and its allies had moved faster. Others counter that the types of weapons provided have shifted based on the changing nature of the war since it began last February, and the growing ability of Ukrainian troops to travel out of the country to get the training they need to operate and maintain the more complicated and high-tech systems. The U.S. and other allies are also using the winter months to send large amounts of weapons and equipment that Ukraine will need when fighting heats up in the spring. Ukraine has persistently asked for tanks, but the U.S. and other allies have resisted sending the heavier, more powerful and complex armored vehicles. America's M1 Abrams tank, for example, carries a far more powerful gun and is more heavily armored, but weighs a lot more and uses jet fuel, rather than diesel. All of that makes it more difficult to maintain and sustain as troops are on the march. U.S. and German officials would not provide precise timelines for when the training would finish and how quickly the armored vehicles could arrive in Ukraine. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz had long been wary of pressure to supply the vehicles to Ukraine and insisted Germany wouldn't go it alone with such deliveries. That led to the tandem announcement with the U.S. commitment this week. Scholz's spokesman, Stefan Hebestreit, told reporters in Berlin that the German vehicles should be ready to go to Ukraine in the first quarter of this year. Germany plans to train Ukrainian forces to use the vehicles, and Hebestreit said experts expect that process to take around 8 weeks. Some noted that there had been a Ukraine-wide air raid alert less than 2 hours into the supposed unilateral ceasefire, due to the launch in Belarus of a Russian hypersonic cruise missile-bearing MiG-31K warplane. Others pointed out that Russian forces had begun the morning by shelling a fire station in the city of Kherson, killing a firefighter. Later, there were reports that Russia had shelled a local hospital in the town of Kurakov, in Donetsk Oblast. And in the key Ukrainian-held Donbass town of Bakhmut, journalists from the U.S. news channel CNN reported that there had been no let-up in incoming or outgoing artillery fire. Novak herself visited Kyiv in November and saw the places where Russian troops had committed atrocities in Ukraine. During the visit, she stated that dictator Vladimir Putin's responsibility for the war was obvious. On January 5, Putin instructed the Minister of Defense of Russia, Sergei Shoigu, to implement a ceasefire along the entire front line in Ukraine from 12 p.m. on January 6 to 12 a.m. on January 8. Moscow time, Kyiv times are 1 hour earlier. The dictator said the decision was prompted by the appeals of one of his regime cronies, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, Patriarch Kirill, as well as his own alleged concern for the religious community. Advisor to the head of the president's office, Mikhailo Podolyak, noted in response that Ukraine, unlike Russia, does not attack foreign territory and does not kill civilians, but only destroys military occupation armies on Ukrainian territory. Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba pointed to the Russian strikes on Kherson on December 24, when many Ukrainians marked Christmas Eve, and the massive attack on Ukraine on New Year's Day. Russian Orthodox Patriarch Kirill, a powerful ally of President Vladimir Putin, is embracing the rhetoric of the medieval crusades in urging support for Moscow's offensive in eastern Ukraine. As humiliating military setbacks for Russia in Ukraine pile up, authorities in Moscow seem increasingly willing to depict the campaign in religious terms. But more than 10 months into Moscow's offensive, Russian authorities, military commanders and propagandists aim to depict the conflict as a battle against the decadent West. In early November, former President Dmitry Medvedev said that Russia faced an existential threat and that the sacred goal was to fight the satanic West. Dozens of Orthodox priests have been sent to the front to support Russian troops. Archpriest Sviatoslav Churkanov said that such missions help guide soldiers in their duty on the battlefield. The cleric said he did not doubt the goals of the offensive, adding that in Ukraine, Russia was defending traditional values. Several Orthodox clerics have died in Ukraine, including Mikhail Vasilyev, who posthumously received from Putin the Hero of Russia award, the country's top honor.